Welcome, everybody. Please take your seats. We're going to get started very promptly. It's exactly 6 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Brian Turner. I'm President and CEO of the Preservation Society of Charleston. And on behalf of my team, I'd first like to extend an enormous thank you to Reverend Dr. Eric Manning and his team at Mother Emanuel for hosting us for this very timely lecture tonight. Thank you. It's not lost on us, and I hope it's not on you, that we're indeed in a very sacred space, a very important place in our community, and we want to do our best to be as respectful as possible while bringing important ideas about current projects to bear and having a discussion about the future of these places in Charleston. I want to also note that we intentionally kept this lecture free and open to the public, and also in hopes that some of you might take the time to think about the church's needs, and particularly the renovation efforts. More details are available at motheremanuel.com. I also want to note in our program there's a QR code to learn about the progress on the Emanuel 9 Memorial that's in production. Tonight's lecture is co-hosted with our friends with the Protect and Respect the Bodies Coalition and the Anson Street African Burial Ground Project. And I want to note that the Anson Street team is celebrating a very important milestone this Sunday as a new memorial to the 36 descendants designed by sculptor Stephen Hayes will be unveiled. I'm going to be brief. I'm going to introduce our introducer. It's my honor to welcome Dr. Millicent Brown. Raised in a family engaged in public service in Charleston, Dr. Brown is an educator, author, and historian who is herself a singular figure in our city's own cultural history as one of the first students to desegregate local public schools in 1963. I also saw her sister Minerva here as well tonight, too. There truly are people from all cross-sections of our community. This topic is really bringing people together, and it's heartening to see. We're excited to be a part of it, and our speaker tonight, I'm really excited for the dialogue that will stem from this discussion. So now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Millicent Brown.
Thank you. You can see up there who Michael Blakey is. I mean, I really don't have to repeat everything that you can read, but we're welcoming him tonight from Virginia, from Williamsburg, where he is the professor, a National Endowment for Humanities professor at the College of William and Mary. This man has spent his entire career trying, not only as an academician, but as a public educator and researcher. And he's been successful at talking to ordinary people like us to help us to understand not just what people in academe know, but that in our regular communities, we understand how history, archaeology, anthropology, biology, how all of these measures come together to really create what we call culture and society. Many of you may know of him because of the groundbreaking work that was no pun intended. I'm sorry. It's really, but the tremendous work that he did as scientific director of the New York African Burial Ground Project that Brian mentioned. That project has gone on to become one of the most significant long-term archaeological research projects in modern times. As a result of the efforts of him, his team of experts and collaborators, we now have in Manhattan the African Burial Ground National Monument. And I'm ready to stop right now and say, and folks are saying, yeah, that's New York. Now, what's that got to do with Charleston? Well, our presenter tonight is going to help us in understanding what those connections really are. One of them, I will say for sure, is that communities throughout this country are being challenged by forces that want to grow and expand and develop at the cost of our ancestors and their sacred burial grounds. And he has been speaking to that issue and helping us to grapple. And we are just so appreciative of the insights that we think he will bring to bear tonight. Usually you stop there because I've introduced a little bit about him. But I told our speaker earlier today, let me tell you who you're talking to. You know, I want to introduce you. And that is to say, we have started in the last several months forming a coalition, a collaboration of young students, people who've never been on a college campus before. We have faith leaders, we have agnostics, we have historians, scientists, preservationists. We have cultural experts, educators. We have just people who are curious. We have ordinary people trying to grapple with some of the serious dynamics that we live with here in Charleston and other people are living with wherever they are. He will share with you insights about the work he has done, including the fact that he just published yet another book, The Blinding Light of Race, Race and Racism in Western Science and Society. I know that you're going to not only enjoy what he has to say, I know you're going to learn something from what he has to say, but I leave you by saying, I hope you will tell other people that Charleston is serious. We are not going to just stand by, as has happened over many years, and let institutions and those in power do whatever it is they think they want to do in our name. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michael Blakey.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. It's an honor to be introduced by you. How wonderful to see all of these people. It's cold outside. So thank you for whatever extra effort it might have taken to get here. Let me also be very appreciative to Reverend Manning for welcoming me to Mother Emanuel Church, and the Preservation Society of Charleston for hosting my visit. And thanks to the many activists I met today for inviting me here. Brian Turner introduced me to the city's religious, political, and educational leaders today. I met Mayor Cogswell and President Hsu. Really appreciated those conversations. It was an honor and a pleasure. I'm encouraged, and I believe, therefore, that there is something for everyone in what I have to say today. I will eventually, after a little bit of a journey, get to the Strangers and Negroes burial ground recently rediscovered. and hopefully the experiences that I've had now, I'm looking at 35 years or something like that, unfortunately quite redundant experiences, may inform a path for you that will avoid some of the redundancies. Those who usually speak in this sacred and historic space practice in their own way that which I express in the secular terms of anthropological science. The truth has many expressions, and I hope that my truth will be usefully related to your own. Homo reminiscens. Anthropologists, at our most fundamental calling, search for the evidence of a greater understanding of what it means to be human. My search, always with the many others who inform it, has led to the characterization of our species as Homo reminiscens, the memorializer. That name reminds us that the first symbolic behavior of the archaeological record of the bipedal, tool-using, food-sharing, fire-making, linguistic variety of life on Earth is the burial or memorialization of the dead. A fact so obvious that it might go without saying, but other species traits, man the wise, the curious, the greedy, the violent, also in evidence, may compete for our attention. Perhaps it is hidden in plain view. Memorialization represents something we call human dignity, a practice which marks all religions and none, from Neanderthals to the Iliad, to church and family cemeteries, to the monument, this monument in front of this building, dedicated to the 9 parishioners who were lost here in 2015, who stirred the empathy of a nation and perhaps of the world. We have all come to know human dignity, marked in this way. It is marked by the Memorial Day freedmen and women began here in Charleston at the racetrack as the Civil War ended. It is Easter. This is a cemetery at the origin of colonial Maryland's St. Mary's. These locations of funeral pyres, of carefully placed field stones, headstones, and monuments, large and small, mark the human presence on our cultural landscape. We all do it, and no other species does. As I've recently had the privilege of traveling the globe with listening sessions of the Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains, burial places, even bodies themselves, right down to a single lock of hair, are permanently endowed with essential meaning by their descendants, are the stuff of who we are, above and beyond other animals, precious and deserving of eternal reciprocity as ancestors. The 17th and 18th century burial ground of approximately 15,000 enslaved Africans you are witnessing here was threatened by development in 1991. It was never abandoned land. It continued to be populated by the dead and the memory of their descendants. It remained a location of human dignity 2 centuries after it was covered with fill and built over by colonial white Americans who gave themselves the rights of property owners. And this is the African Burial Ground in New York. Those property owners, as they call themselves, had participated in a lie 100 years before and for 200 years after. The lie that these blacks were not real, complete persons, deserving of dignity. Through the long construction of an ideology of white supremacy, that pretense was constructed by science and society to cover the immorality of slavery, to make people their property, along with all the wealth those enslaved people were forced to create for them. Their anatomical scientists would also rob the graves of Africans and poor white people in New York, as they did in Richmond, Virginia, as J. Marion Sims, educated in Charleston, famously experimented on living enslaved women in Alabama for the expressed benefit of white people. In the late 20th century, as the federal government sought to build a 34-story office building in Manhattan, the National Historic Preservation Act required archaeology to mitigate damage to cultural resources or historical archaeological evidence. The 18th century evidence included the trash and adjacent industries, a pottery and a tannery, white people had dumped on the graves that enslaved African descendants had carefully made. One witnesses as ground truth a contestation of humanity, both above and below the ground, slavery and its rebellions, memorialization and its disregard. New York's African burial ground lay under continued development for 200 more years, when the question would again arise as to whether or not white people had learned to respect the human rights of black people, a question answered in the language of memorial. This slide shows is an archaeological site map produced during the archaeology on that site that I described under the National Historic Preservation Act. And the burials are, the different colors represent rough initial age assessments, sex assessments, and other characteristics. Public outcry. In 1991, the National Historic Preservation Act, which called for archaeological research to take place ahead of construction, did not require, it only allowed, mitigation of damage to the African burial grounds' humane significance for their descendants. That protection would require a descendant community to come forward en masse with others who respected their human dignity to show they cared. And so they did, in the thousands in the early 1990s. Protests and prayer vigils in New York's streets and churches, and lobbying in the halls of power went on for years. These sustained, ardent, politically threatening events in New York City resonated throughout the nation and the world of Homo reminiscens. Here you see Mayor David Dinkins talking to one of the archaeologists and the skeletal biologists who were early on the site. We would replace them. Also with them are black preservationists, Howard Dodson's there, Peggy King Yorta, and public officials prior to the congressional field hearing held by Congressman Gus Savage. From Gracie Mansion to Capitol Hill, a resolution would be eventually brought about, but not before a tortured dozen-year public process that forced respect for black people's dignity upon a stubborn, disympathetic, blind, deaf, and numb swarming of white people's insistence upon their interests alone. In the ensuing battle, the interests of developers and poorly trained anthropologists who wanted lucrative contracts to study the site were waged against those of African American descendants who insisted upon their dignity. its long fought-out resolution would be led by a federal advisory committee dominated by an African-American descendant community who inserted themselves into the decision-making process. As the public stakes rose and the site's moral significance was revealed, white-controlled agencies, including the New York Landmarks Commission, the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, and professional archaeologists of New York, began offering as high-grounded democratic ideal, or a high-sounding democratic ideal, that decisions should be made by multiple stakeholders, that a multicultural approach, they said, should be taken to the study of all American history this site was then said to represent being part of. Black people did not misunderstand that its premise of a race-neutral meritocracy, the level playing field, the post-racial society, was false. This was an effort to elevate the voice of white people, not the neutral, objective, universal human voice they had arrogated to themselves, but to authorize as the dominant voice of a particular social group with its own deep subjectivity. Therefore, if they were swept into this business as usual of sharing decision-making with multiple white appointed agencies and representatives, their particular interests in the stewardship of their own dignity would be lost to what Lonnie Guinier describes as the tyranny of the majority. This multiple stakeholder control was simply to become white people's control and profit from a cemetery and site they neither understood nor demonstrated they truly cared about through previous scholarship and interpretation in the city. This is the first we heard of this interest. It was a lot of money. And then, perhaps to touch on the subtlety and a strange duplicity that may not be obvious, let me give some of the dialogue that occurred around who would do the archaeology. And I would hear, well, can't we just learn? That was the sound of white entitlement I heard at the time, to justify preserving privileges of unmerited white people, anthropologists and others, who had never taken an interest or gotten the training in African and African-American archaeology, but they were there, they wanted the contract. Can't we just learn? Black scholars had consistently demonstrated both an investment in learning and caring about Black people and their history, while establishing their own authority over the disposition of remains African-American descendants. Asked for my consultation and that of other Black scholars on the site who had that training. I assembled a large and sophisticated research team of diverse scholars. I could find people of diverse races. They were not able to find Black people earlier. Did you ever hear of that? That offered to work only at the behest of the descendant community on the basis of their informed consent. We offered proposals to the descendant-controlled steering committee for community evaluation, inviting them to offer their own research questions. An ethical clientage model was formulated in that moment. Our participation would be limited to the empirical practice of anthropologists, the profession, the standards of our profession, whose truth would be based upon the evidence. We acknowledged our responsibility also to our business client, the government agency, the U.S. General Services Administration, that would pay for the research, which we would be contracted to perform. Yet our principal obligation, the ethical obligation to the informed consent of those most affected by the treatment of human remains, would be to the descendant community, our ethical client. For more than a year, we discussed potential research questions in public forums to which the descendant community contributed and which they would ultimately formally accept as worthy of holding those remains out of the ground for a limited period of time prior to reburial. Excuse me. The questions covered African origins, the transformation from diverse African societies to African Americans, by which they meant culturally, socially, and even biologically. Third, the physical quality of life during enslavement, which paleopathologists, those who look at human remains, and as one colleague referred to it, and read them as text, the kind of information we find readily. And the fourth question was modes of resistance to slavery that marked the human qualities of enslaved Africans in New York. Now a project of the people, dignified by ethics, would lead to a moving effort with broad public interest. These publicly generated research questions would be worthy of nearly $6 million under our research projects control at Howard University. The project, after a dozen years, produced a 2,500-page interdisciplinary set of volumes spanning skeletal biology, genetics, archaeology, and history. It has become, and I need to say this now after 30 years, I challenge you to test it. It has become the most sophisticated bioarchaeology yet to be produced. The African Burial Ground National Monument site has our 2009 volumes available. I hope you will read them and consider it for yourself. They are written for our colleagues, but we tried our best to use good English and to break down our process so that anybody would understand with a bit of education. According to the 2 presidential awards I was recently privileged to receive from the world's largest anthropological organization, the American Anthropological Association, the African Burial Ground was 30 years ahead of our colleagues. It was the primary model of bioarchaeological practice we, in the Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains, could take around the world to show that science, even better science, can be ethically done under the principle of informed consent. All along, however, the descendant community was empowered to decide not to do research at all. Were we unable to show sufficiently useful research questions worthy of their memory, they, as the rightful stewards of their ancestral remains, held the right to decide on immediate reburial and memorialization. They could engage religious leaders to memorialize their ancestors immediately, as is the usual custom of dignified human beings. Instead, in this situation, in this circumstance, we scientists, leaders of diverse religions, politicians, and artists walked these ancestors home, together, each in our own ways, sharing the same road. Here's an example of our ongoing work that combines the questions in some way, the 4 questions in many ways. A study conducted by Olanrewaju Lasisi and Jessica Bittner on musculoskeletal stress indicators That is a muscle attachment called the linea aspera in the thigh. It's showing an increased frequency of muscular strain, that is enlarged muscle attachment, in enslaved men and women over the course of the 18th century. That is, to read it at the beginning of the 18th century in the early period on the left, to about the Revolutionary War in the late period on the right, and you see the increasing frequency of hypertrophic linea aspera. Strain was especially evident in women at the end of the century, and we explained it in these ways, though they're a little confounded, and that's life. That one, the English increasingly relied on women's importation and labor as a means of social control in response to two rebellions. And this is the first explanation. When we have lots of historical evidence that there was a 1712 rebellion and a 1741 rebellion, immediately after which we see in the census that the number of men in the colony, enslaved men, dropped off precipitously, and women were then being imported with children directly from the African continent. My close colleague, Leslie Rankin-Hill, who's written the one real important book on Philadelphia, bioarchaeology of that African-American population, concluded that, well, it seems they preferred raising a black child, a black boy, to importing a grown man, and many of them had been involved in wars at the time. The second additional or confounding explanation is that, and we know it is true, that later period during the Revolutionary War included an increasing number of women who had fled north to join the British from South Carolina and elsewhere to New York during the American Revolution. Those who lived would make their way to Nova Scotia, then Sierra Leone, after the war. This information augments and contradicts historical treatments of kinder slavery, good masters in the North. And here in the floor of the National Monument are individual identities of the kind that was possible. Here in the U.S. National Monument that replaced the GSA's initially proposed plaque on the wall of their building is indication of the presence of one of the many infants, no name, but not unknown. The African Burial Ground National Monument opened to the public in 2007, following a major art and architecture competition won by Rodney Leon. Only part of the originally planned building would be built, in which a visitor center devoted to the history of New York Africans and slavery is installed on the first floor. It's at 290 Broadway. Please visit it when you're in New York. The Sankofa, an Akan Adinkra symbol that means look to the past to inform the present and as a guide to the future, was possibly identified on the coffin lid of Burial 101. There are other interpretations, but everybody liked this one. 101's dental chemistry is associated with American birth. We, in fact, in this project, innovated the use of dental chemistry to ascertain where an individual had been born. Yet his modest dental modification, his teeth are slightly filed, but clearly filed deliberately, demonstrated his African memory. The reburial ceremony, rites of ancestral return, was organized by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, an African-American-led institution of the New York Public Library. And here also in those ceremonies, his mother, Blakey, no relation, of Queen Mother Moore's Church, whose congregation fought for the site's dignity for 12 years. Joy, satisfaction, and a sense of empowerment, I think, amid the resolving strife. All joined in the reburial ceremonies. This example shows that the characteristics of our species may coexist, that Homo reminiscens and Homo sapiens can and should exist as one. Only greed and a dehumanizing dissympathy would urge unethical development to go forward atop the burial ground, as it would have without broad public empathy and powerful political protest. Why should it have required so much strife? Again, this 1990s situation was not the first time Africans had experienced an affront to their human dignity in New York. And in the language of memorial, the trash from colonial industries strewn across the archaeological strata, the grave robbing, the taking and attempted erasure of the site made private property, repeatedly stood against African descendants' insistence upon the dignity of careful burials. Descendants who were themselves called property. For the more than 2 centuries between then and now, an ideology of white supremacy would be written in the language of science and material conditions to justify white people's continued unjust taking as though justified by nature, if not by their God. This epic travesty is the topic of my new series of 3 books, The Blinding Light of Race, released by Routledge Press this year. The disempathy, I call it, I invented a word, of the GSA in the 1990s should be directly connected to that which was to justify slaveholding in the 1700s. The idea stands that white people are enabled to see themselves as the only real, complete people in the room with opportunistic decisions, when opportunistic decisions are made about the other. It is not over yet. As a law in Florida, the Stop Woke Act, and policies in the White House now tell us that the uncomfortable truths of our society, Black history, they think, should not be taught for the protection of the rights and sensitivities of persons, is its language. But persons, from the vantage of that law, unmarked by any other name, are white. Racist efforts to hide the truth about the humanity of Black people and the human flaws of white people have been at the center of American inequity for too long. These childish lies are required to justify the unjustifiable. Whoever said the truth shall set you free was not lying. Even Thomas Jefferson, despite his contradictions, realized that knowledge was required for democracy, thus the University of Virginia. During Jim Crow, Albert Einstein wrote that the perpetuation of racist lies was meant to maintain conditions, and he was speaking in 1946, closest to slavery for white people's continued comfort, as he put it. When will this legacy of the dishonesty required for slavery end? What will we, as adult persons, do to end it? I believe there's no more dignified way to announce those human truths than in the language of memorial. Charleston Cemetery, long unabandoned, was created in the ugliest contradictions of the trade in human beings. Other cemeteries are similarly positioned. This, in the Cementerio dos Pretos Novos in Rio de Janeiro, is such a burial ground. It is a mass grave of the burned bodies of those who arrived at the port only to die in quarantine. Here in Rio are the monuments erected in its community center, created by the owner of the house who found it had been built upon a cemetery, who chose to collaborate with descendant community. It references the New York African burial ground prominently in its interpretation. The island nation of St. Eustatius, whose governor visited my institute in October, is seeking to memorialize an entire island hub in the slave trade filled with such cemeteries. I believe, as the anthropological record shows, as the legislation supporting Native American rights to their ancestral remains implies, and as the global listening sessions of our anthropological commission have found, that descendants are not just stakeholders. Or one might rather say that all stakeholders are not equal in all things. Dignity resides in descendant stewardship of their ancestral remains. No one else has equal ethical right to determine the disposition of another's dead. Every army knows that. Finally, let me speak to Charleston's strangers and Negro burial ground. As directly as the freed Negroes of New York did in the hours preceding the Doctors' Riot of 1788. They said that the doctors of physic, as they called the medical grave robbers, should stop their wanton desecration of their cemetery at night or find themselves vulnerable to attack in that same dark hour. These African Americans were willing to accede to some anatomical work under their own terms, but not this. Unheeded, the doctors' riot nearly overwhelmed the city. Numb. The GSA did not initially heed my message from black legislators that they should stop fighting against dignity while I was their chief consultant in 1992. Instead, this $60 billion agency would be wrestled to the ground for a dozen years following an estimated cost of millions and much lost stature. In the end, the truth went out. A national monument was made, and real dignity was found. If in compromise with white neighbors who had never before given grandmother, I will call that site grandmother, her proper respect. My kinder metaphor, learned from the respected Christian ministers with whom I have spoken, is that while one wishes the congregation and neighbors to attend the funeral, it is the family that determines the final disposition of their dead. In Richmond, Virginia, the descendant community for the East Marshall Street well calls itself the Representative Family Council. And this is a site of evidence of grave robbing for the Medical College of Virginia. That Family Representative Council was aided in forming by Virginia Commonwealth University's planning committee, which is a good thing to have, that was charged with knowing, helping them to convene, but knowing when to step back and take that council's recommendations as authoritative. There are also examples of failures around the country. The Moses Cemetery descendant community in Montgomery County, Maryland, has regularly protested for 8 years, in a McDonald's parking lot beside a construction fence most weeks, most weekends, to stop construction of a storage facility possibly atop its ancestral remains. The county supervisor, Mark Ehrlich, has been steadfast against even allowing them the archaeological information necessary to know where their ancestors are. They are left in pain and a rebellious commitment to prevail. Ehrlich's protection of development slowly fails. As James Madison's Montpelier estate, at his estate, the National Trust for Historic Preservation drafted a rubric enabling the empowerment of descendants with structural parity over governance of the interpretation of slavery at that historic presidential site, and with Elizabeth Chu's collaboration. The old white Board of Trustees tried to refuse descendant empowerment by standing their token representatives rather than those chosen by the descendants' own organization. A hackneyed ploy of tokenization. They would, because these descendants are well-educated and traveled people who have access to New York Times op-eds, that though that old white board would suffer public embarrassment in the press. The descendants, winning that battle, are currently proceeding under the ethical clientage model to build a fine memorial for their enslaved ancestors with $5 million donated by the Mellon Foundation and $1 million by the Commonwealth of Virginia, thanks to Governor Northern. People can learn. There would be no skeletal research. It's their choice. They successfully conducted a design-build competition to which some of the world's best architects came running to be part of this. My question for you, as Stuart Hall once framed it, is what will you do at the moment of decision in Charleston's current confluence of events, in the crafting of our collective future? Human beings have always been driven to share reciprocity and justice. In a plural democracy, justice prevails when respect for each is achieved. Everyone will have a turn as a descendant of someone. No one, certainly not in the real history of the United States of America, represents the ancestors of everyone. The American Anthropological Association Commission has agreed with the world that descendants are the stewards of their ancestors and that no one ethically owns human remains. Now, this cemetery in Charleston that is currently in the hands of the College of Charleston, it has two sides. The larger side is for Negroes, free blacks and the enslaved and a large number of folks who were like those in Rio or St. Eustatius dumped because, they died too soon to be sold. The other side was for strangers. When the Puritans referred to strangers 100 years before, this was towards the end of the 18th century, but 100 years about the turn of the 18th century, they meant those who were not Puritans. And maybe so I'm hoping it might also, one might explore whether it may also mean those who are not Protestants. It also is, well, just a moment, please. Sorry, I would want to cite the report of Tula et al. On the public burial ground. That's where you will find the information about that burial ground. It's a very good report. So it includes these various white people, immigrants, those who did not share churches with Protestants, others. And so there might be 2 or more descendant communities, one of which is African American. And so what I have experienced and shared with you suggests that as you attempt to resolve this problem, that a committee has already been formed by the college, that it be expanded as a planning committee that will facilitate the assembly of descendant communities, 2 or more, who will be informed by perhaps a year or 2 of discussion of the significance of the site, its history, the history of slavery in Charleston, to understand the lives of those ancestors, thus to make, and then one might talk about whether are research questions worthy, research questions in that conversation, and then to give their informed consent. In New York, such a committee existed. It had a memorial subcommittee, it had a science subcommittee deciding what kind of science the descendants would be comfortable with and what kind of memorial they wanted. And I think we've seen the results are good in New York. I believe the results might ultimately be good here in Charleston. And it is really that, that ethical basis of the empowerment of descendants that may be, at least for me, is what distinguishes that which is good and that which is not. So I've shared these ideas with you. I look forward to any questions and comments you have. Thank you. Yes.
Going back to the New York site, before the ground was broken on I would say, thank you for your informed information tonight. Going back to the New York site, before the ground was broken and you showed a multi-tiered level of, what we'd say, uncovering the burial grounds and the remnants there, was there a known established burial site, Potter's Field, on that Duane Street location?
Yeah. It rarely occurred in historical documentation, but it was available to the first research team that conducted the phase one archival background, like the Tulla study here, in 1989, which is 2 years before ground was broken. They indicated that the burial ground was there. At some point in the past, the burial ground had been there. Essentially, was it in that report? Certainly by the time the archaeologists started digging, and I think it was in that initial report as well, they had, and I will say in retrospect, conveniently assessed that most of the remains were gone and might only be found under an alleyway, an old alleyway that had existed since the time that the cemetery had been closed, 1794, when it had been built over, prior to the expansion of the city that put 16 feet of fill on top of that. When I first noticed it, there was a press hearing in 1991, October of 91, at which they announced finding, I think it was a dozen burials already. And so I think the writing was on the wall. It would go to 419 or so, 427 really. And then Congressman Savage and Mayor Dinkins, backed by large community outcry. Well, after GSA then closed it, stopped the archaeology. But yes, they could have known. They should have known.
You made it known.
I am just your humble servant, sir.
But that's what we plan to do here. Make it known. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I just over here. I want to say thank you as well for showing up here all the way from Virginia. As like a 19-year-old who wants to get into this line of advocacy work, I just want to know what kept you going and what kept you and your team going in the face of all that adversity and all that challenge.
On the one hand, I feel compelled to say, you have no idea from this presentation just how much it was thrown at everyone. From the beginning, it was clear to me who was right and who would win. You know, the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation in DC and Mayor Dinkins and State Senator Patterson's committees invited me to come. I was writing the book that I was writing despite a contract for this book that I've now written 30-some years later. So I needed to go up, and I was a monthly review press, so I needed to go up there anyway. So talk about the book with the publisher, and so, okay, we put this together. And I go on the site and talk to the people there, archaeologists and community. By the time I left, I guess within a couple of days, there was a bi-weekly community meeting, and I let them know that our laboratory at Howard University would be available to them because the contract for analysis had not been let, but the excavation was already paid for and in process, because, you know, I was not going to let poorly trained people who had, you know, some of whose language and smacked of racism, do the analysis of what was then the most important, some argued most important archaeological site, certainly American archaeological site. And so, but for every reason, I saw community rising. I knew why. Of course they were rising. They were compelling. They were irresistible. There was only one way to go, and I had some of the tools that would be necessary to take it in directions I thought were useful. So I got out of the book contract. You have to do what you have to do, I think. That's right. Mm-hmm. So, gentleman here.
Hi, Dr. Blakey. Thanks for this. One of the things that's always amazed me about this burial ground, this particular burial ground, and others here in town, and I assume in New York, is just the sheer volume of bodies, right? Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? Just what the burial practices were in these potter fields that enabled so many bodies to be in a relatively small amount of space over a period of time?
Well, I can't, I think, and if Dr. Tula is here, she might well complement what I'm saying with more detail. As I recall, the burials the bodies were in coffins, by and large, as they were in New York, although in the late period, when there's this influx of self-liberated Southern Africans who are, sort of temporary in the city, just coming into the city and being buried, not even by their relatives, but it's a war, it's disruption and confusion. There are more frequently burials without coffins. But I would imagine that they would very well just dump a body in the ground here. But as I remember the report, they were in coffins. Dr. Tula, would you comment on this?
Hi. We do know that beginning in 1801, there is an ordinance because this was a city cemetery, a municipal cemetery. There were, surprisingly, regulations that they had to abide by beginning in 1801, which is when this cemetery was active. So we know potential shaft dimensions, we know depth, and that kind of allows us in the report to gather how many people could potentially be within this project area. So the report is live online and free to anyone who'd like to read it. And you can see the 1801 ordinance regulations, numbers, dimensions, all of that. But of course, as Dr. Blakey said, in times of duress, especially we know as the transatlantic slave trade reopened, there could have been a lot more burials taking place within a single shaft. So we do have, though, those dimensions chronicalized inside that report, but we'll see.
Would you give that reference so everybody knows how to get a copy?
Sure. So that report, it was commissioned by the College of Charleston, and if you go to the Cumming Street Commons website, you will see a tab for, I think College of Charleston called it Cultural Preservation. You click on Cultural Preservation and you should see our report. We did a report on the YWCA as well as the burial ground, and both those links are on that website. And it was an honor to give a voice to these individuals.
Thanks. And just one other detail to be responsive to the question. In New York and Philadelphia, where in the latter case, the first African Baptist church was excavated, these are urban cemeteries like the one here. They have limited space, they become crowded, and so one finds that burials are made over top of other burials as they begin to become very active cemeteries. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm sorry, I can't see you. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Anna Johnson, and you touch on a lot of things that has opened my mind. I can't remember all of it, but two that stands out. You touched a little bit on abandoned cemeteries. So I'm wondering if this was considered an abandoned cemetery here on Cumming Street. I hear that phrase a lot in Charleston, referring to a lot of the plantation cemeteries when people had to leave the plantation. The dead didn't leave. Mm-hmm. The cemetery was not abandoned. Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned about the descendants and how they're seeking dignity for their family remains, and how that should really be considered much more than we are hearing now. It's like you have no say. So if you could just kind of touch a little bit more on those two for me, elaborate, I would really appreciate that.
Well, Brian, you were educating me on the technical legal meaning of abandonment. There is a legal meaning that
Without reservation by deed.
Without reservation by deed is the simple legal language. Thank you. But I've emphasized what you've emphasized. I've got language too, and right, it's not abandoned by the dead or memory. They have attempted to to abandon our memory by the erasures of these attempts to erase these cemeteries with development. But like the truth, they're still there. They're still encountered. And maybe until something proper is done, they will continue to trouble us.
And I have to add that, because we are known as a holy city here. Churches everywhere. I just can't see how we can disallow this to continue on with, the saying of, well, these places have been abandoned and we can just go and build and do whatever, development we want to do. I think everybody should be mad as can be about that. Here, here.
We'll take two more
There's a
questions
couple.
here.
There's one over here and one over here.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
Needs a,
Hi. So I had a question about burial. So with these with the building of structures over these burials. So as we know, I can imagine. Oh, thank you. So as some can imagine, there is, important history that is lost. So in doing your research, I wanted to ask you, do you think over time we can find that we can find whoever these people are and potentially trace them back to people that's living today, and I guess I'm asking, do you think that this is that this would be a way to help people find their distant relatives or long lost loved ones and so forth?
thanks. That's a good question. Geneticists have sometimes promised that they can do that, but they do not have the methodological capability of doing that, of identifying the relationship between a specific skeleton and a living person that, in a way you would recognize, like that this was my great-great-grandfather or mother, that kind of recognition, other than
Can they at least tie it to the DNA of living people, and that could give, can they at least tie it to the DNA of living people, and it'll help
So-
people like you and me find clues, or?
So let me say, genetic relationships are probabilistic. They can give you the probability given the comparative samples that they have, that you are associated with one or another population of genomes. Frankly, historical records often do at least as well or better. And oral history is important for what one can know. If your family have roots in Charleston, if you know they were enslaved somewhere in this area, then, and I'm going to fold in here something else, which is the definition of descendant community, then you are potentially a member of the descendant community. You don't need DNA to show that. DNA sometimes will mislead you as well because it's probabilistic. It sometimes will give you a sound, answer as well. So if you have a history that's connected with the area where these individuals died, you only need meet one other criterion to be a member of the descendant community. That's by the definition I gave 30 years ago when I coined the term descendant community. You must care. If you demonstrate that you care, and you are part of the social community that is descended from those ancestors, which means you're an African American, at best from this area or some surrounding plantations, that's as close a call as you're going to get, and that would put you in a position to need to be part of the determination of informed consent. Because if something is done with your ancestral remains, homo reminiscens, that you find to be desecrating, you can be hurt. And the most fundamental part of ethics is to do no harm. And so, but it's important to know about what's going on, what their history is, what's proposed for their disturbance, archaeological or developmental, so that you can speak to it in an informed way. And if it is offensive, and you feel emotionally harmed, there's an ethical violation. These things are always, weighed, and ethics is not an exact art or science, but that's the essence of it. Is there one other over here? Thank you for your
Thank you, Dr.
question.
Blakey. That was my question to you, right here.
Oh, I see.
Hey,
Oh.
Lachey. That
Hi,
was my
Ms.
question to
Woodward.
you, to explain to the community about descendant community. Thank you. Beautiful job.
I have colleagues who say, well, what is that? How do we know? Have we done their DNA? We know that this is their family? Smithsonian has now been convinced that is not part of the definition of descendant community. They refuse to do DNA now because it's been, they won't do DNA now. For descendants, because they recognize that DNA is not magic. And if they, so it is being part of the social community that has survived, and in the case of African Americans, thrived quite a bit, and that you care. And that's not hard to demonstrate. When people stand up, we know that they care. They're also, with less empowerment, I think, over the determination of descendants, there should be also communities of care. If white people help, rather than get in the way, that would be good. and watch the dignified thing take place. Be part of making space for that. All right.
Thank you. I just want to extend another round of applause for Dr. Blakey. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, for casting a light on our community. This is truly a compelling group, as you mentioned. It's easy to be a part of people who want to figure out this situation in love and care for the descendants here. And I think that this talk was absolutely essential for us being empowered and having the ability to use those tools moving forward. So thank you so much for coming.